Hello, young sir. How are you?
How are you? All right, thank you. You well?
I'm well, thank you. How are you? I am.
No, that's fine. So we'll put some pictures.
Have you done your betting yet?
Where Alan is? I've been out there a couple of times. He's given me the ticket over there.
He said wherever you want to be.
Sure?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Now we can sit down.
Sit down.
Everyone's nice, isn't it?
Yeah, I put it there. You put in there. No, somebody put it there. I put it in there too. It's like a different person. Right. So where do you put the kid? Next to the child. Oh, right.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Goodness, thank you very much indeed for that nice warm response. Welcome to Basingstoke, and can I thank Basingstoke for hosting this EFDD meeting this evening. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. It's an enormous pleasure to bring EFDD and to explain the issues surrounding Brexit. Brexit, of course, dominating the media, the press, but for the issue and the awful scenario that unfolded on Saturday evening. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had for a long, long time an entente cordiale with France. May I ask you all to stand and mark for 1 minute, please, our sympathy and our support for that country and for the enormous distress they've gone through. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that. Your programme this evening, everyone, I will speak for a short period, then I will introduce a very, very important and pertinent video. And then, of course, Nigel Farage, political icon at the moment in the United Kingdom, who has foreseen so many of the issues that have unfolded over the last few months. He will then speak and will also take questions. I have on the desk over there a small pile of questions, and it's a recognition, if you like, of audience participation both here in the Anvil Centre, but also within social media circles, the interest that this meeting has. But I'm going to start by talking for a very short period and just setting the scene for you. And I'm going to start with a quote from Mikhail Gorbachev, would you believe? But he was a political reformer in the former Soviet Union and was way ahead of his time when he uttered these words. And his words were, "The most puzzling development in politics during the last decade is the apparent determination of Western European leaders to recreate the old Soviet Union, but in Europe." And how pertinent those words were. And I make no apology whatsoever for using those words to open my contribution to this evening's proceedings. Because for far too long, this country has suffered from a democratic deficit and also an honesty deficit by both the European Union, but also the United Kingdom politicians. Now, Jean Monnet also made a very, very important statement, and he issued these words. And these words, everybody, should strike fear in your hearts and in your minds, whether you're a Scot, whether you're Welsh, or whether you're English, or whether you are somebody who's come to live in these islands. Europe's nations should be led towards a superstate without their people understanding what is happening. Well, thankfully, everyone, it's almost as though the European Union veil has been lifted from the eyes of citizens across Europe. And here in the United Kingdom, we actually can do something to turn the tide against Monnet's words. And in doing so, the United Kingdom will have and will exercise a democratic choice on its future relationship with the European Union, but also with Europe. It's going to be contentious for months to come. We've already seen, and we will see more, of the vested commercial and business interests that will continue to try and portray Brexit as an Armageddon scenario. They'll use disreputable misrepresentation of information, job losses, world trade position, and the UK's contribution to global decision-making. They would have it that all of that is going to be binned. The European Union-funded propaganda will continue to try and compound the dishonesty and the misrepresentation. But meetings such as this one in Basingstoke will address Brexit concerns in an open, in a transparent, and in a verifiable manner. Now, what will be the goal? Well, the goal is a full, free, and fair referendum with a public properly informed in advance about the facts. It's not a renegotiation fudge. There's a lot to be done in a very short time frame, if indeed June 2016 is selected for the referendum polling date, and no one can be sure of that. Countering media bias and international interference. I didn't take kindly to Barack Obama telling me, a United Kingdom citizen, what he thinks I should do in terms of European Union membership. And I hope you share that comment. But everyone here tonight or listening Just remember, the United Kingdom is a sovereign nation. It's not an American or a Japanese car manufacturing outpost. The United Kingdom can and it will stand tall without the European Union systems doing all that is possible to obtain a yes to stay in outcome. Now remember that what the European Union wants, what the bureaucrats want, is that we, the United Kingdom, become a minor region of a European Union superstate in a Brussels, Strasbourg, Luxembourg-led European government. That is why this referendum will be so defining for the United Kingdom in terms of its relationship with those three sites and all that they entail. But any pretense of renegotiation, that's just farce. The EU will never admit its mistakes. It'll never actually admit or recognise the consequences of some of its ill-judged policies. And it will never, ever recognise some of the fundamental flaws that now show the direction of travel, the way the European Union wants to manage the decades to come. Just remind yourselves, if you had the choice now to join the European Union, let me use this analogy and see how you feel about it. Would you want to join a club going down in a competitive league? Would you want to play for a losing team? Would you want to buy goods or services of ever-diminishing quality? Would you want to invest or save with organisations unable to withstand financial scrutiny? Because that's where the European Union is now, and it will only get worse. Ever more harmonisation for European states, ever more member states enlargement, ever more economic convergence, and quite possibly, despite what David Cameron says, Eurozone membership for the United Kingdom. To all these aspects, I say no. To continued European Union membership, I say no. To Brexit, to restoration of UK sovereignty, and the UK's position in the world, I say yes. So David Cameron, bring it on. Name that date and let battle truly commence. I started with a quote, and I'm going to finish with a quote. I'm sure you will recognise these immortal words. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Remember, it's your future, it's your children's future, it's your grandchildren's future. The future of the United Kingdom is in your hands. Thank you, everyone.
Include not just people coming from war, not just people coming from failed states. Mr. Juncker this morning seemed to suggest that perhaps it would even include people who were fleeing poverty. I'm sorry, we simply can't accept countless millions. There is a real and genuine threat. When ISIS say they want to flood our continent with 500,000 Islamic extremists, they mean it. Indeed, I fear we face a direct threat to our civilization if we allow large numbers of people from that war-torn region into Europe. I promise my party will stand up to this impending disaster for all concerned. A month ago, I warned Mr. Timmermans that this common EU asylum policy had absolutely no security checks whatsoever, and that there was a real, genuine threat of ISIS using this policy to infiltrate our countries and to pose great dangers to our society. People said I had no evidence for it. Well, now even the Libyan intelligence agencies are saying that ISIS not only are making money from trafficking people, but they are beginning to directly send us their terrorists. We have to have another think. We must not allow our compassion to imperil our security.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the video. Now please welcome Nigel Farage, joint leader of the EFDD group, author of many of those very, very well acknowledged speeches in Brussels and in Strasbourg, who saw the issues unlike any of the other political leaders could. Please welcome Nigel Farage, everyone.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much indeed for coming along in such amazing numbers. I'm sure that you, with me, share the absolute horror and total revulsion at what happened in Paris last Friday. And we should not for one moment pretend that this was an isolated one-off attack. It just happens to be the worst one that we've seen on European soil of many. The thing that I suppose that makes me angry about what happened in Paris is frankly the fact that it was so utterly and entirely predictable. I think we've reached a point where we have to admit to ourselves, in Britain and France and much of the rest of Europe, that mass immigration and multicultural division has, for now, been a failure. The pace of people coming, the sheer numbers of people coming has been too fast, has been too great, that it's proved impossible for us to have integrated societies. And I'm afraid there is, and we have to be honest and frank about this and talk about these things without being fearful. There is a problem with some of the Muslim community in this country. There is a problem, and we have to be honest about it. Our politicians, I'm afraid, haven't had the guts. We've known for years about the hate preachers saying things for which any of the rest of us would have been arrested on the spot. We know about the problems of the Trojan horses that we've seen in our schools and our prisons. And we have to also look, perhaps, at the population. There are now 3 million Muslim people living in Britain. That is an increase of 75% over the course of the last 10 years. And yet within that now significantly large group of people, there is considerable alienation, particularly amongst many of their young. It is deeply worrying that after the Charlie Hebdo attacks earlier this year in Paris, when polled, 27% of British Muslims expressed some sympathy with the motives that had carried out that massacre. 11% of that 3 million said they thought that the people who'd produced those cartoons of Muhammad actually deserved to be attacked. And amongst the 16 to 24-year-olds, there are about a third of young Muslims in Britain who've got very split and divided loyalties. In fact, it seems that a third think their loyalty to their religion or the interpretation of the religion they're told is greater than it is to this country. Now, that on the face of it looks pretty depressing, but actually there is within this an interesting message of hope, because that same sample of people, when they were asked, do they feel loyalty to the country in which they live, 95% said yes. When they were asked, did they think British law should be the supreme law of the country, 93% said yes. So how is it that the same sample of people can give two such contradictory answers? The reason is there is a tremendous conflict. There is a split of loyalties. That on the one hand, people want to get on and want to be happy and want to get on with their neighbours and want their kids to play with each other. But on the other, they're being told things. They're being told things via the internet, but they're being told things in some of our mosques that directly conflict with the way that most normal people would want to live. And I have to say that in many ways, our perpetual neocon approach, where we go on trying to get rid of leaders of Arab and North African countries and think bombing is the answer to everything, in many ways we've made it easy for some of these people. But we have to attempt to stop this constant dripping of poison in the ears of young British Muslims. And we have every reason to believe that the main source of this problem is coming from money. Money that is pouring into our universities, money that is pouring into our mosques, and it's coming from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is funding this extreme ideology. Incidentally, this is the same Saudi Arabia who have so far refused to take a single person from war-torn Syria or anywhere else in the region. The same Saudi Arabia who said they don't want to take large numbers of refugees or migrants because they fear it might upset the balance of their society. And yet it's the same Saudi Arabia that is now prepared to fund the building of 200 mosques in Germany. I was told tonight by a media source, well, Mr. Farage, what you're saying would threaten our trade with Saudi Arabia. I think our security and our safety matters more than our trade with Saudi Arabia. And I have a proposal that I think could solve this problem. I propose that all churches and all faith groups in this country should in future, under law, have to declare publicly all their sources of income. And if the money for any church or faith group is coming from a legitimate background, then of course there is nothing to fear. But that is the way I think we can sort this problem out. We cannot go on with our so-called friend Saudi Arabia doing these things. And frankly, I have to say, I think if we can stop the money, if we can stop the funding of the hate preachers, then I hope and believe that there'll be many, many voices within the Muslim community who will be emboldened to speak to their young people and to teach them some common sense. And yes, we need some plain speaking about this word multiculturalism. For the great and the good and the political class, it has been in many ways their test of moral superiority. You know, I support multiculturalism, therefore I'm a better, finer person than you. But it all means what we define multiculturalism. If you're talking about a country that has a broad ethnic and religious mix made up of people who come to Britain from all over the world, in many cases because of our relationship with those countries in the past through empire, in many cases through our relationship with those countries who came and stood beside us in 2 world wars and who speak our language, then we haven't got a problem. We haven't got a problem. But if we're talking about the encouragement of different groups within our society, within our communities, we're talking about the encouragement of them to be as different as possible and not to integrate at all, then we have a problem. And actually what we've seen from our political leaders in this case of radical Islam is we have seen appeasement, we have seen gutlessness, we have seen a total failure of leadership. I was in the car in June, listening to a Radio 4 morning interview with the Prime Minister. And the interviewer said, well, Mr. Cameron, do we not face a real threat from Islamic State? Oh, no, the Prime Minister said. You mustn't call it Islamic State. It's got nothing to do with Islam. And today, Theresa May, the Home Secretary in the House of Commons, in her statement responding to these appalling events in Paris, said that ISIS is nothing to do with Islam. Well, I'm sorry, but again, we have to be frank. Every single one of those killers believed they were doing what they were doing in the name of Islam. And our weakness, the weakness of our leaders, has actually allowed in our country the creation of a parallel society. Tens of thousands of cases of female genital mutilation performed in this country every single year, and as yet not a single person has been convicted. A blind eye turned to polygamy, to forced marriage, and now 80% of Muslim marriages in Britain are conducted and completely outside and unregistered by UK civil law. And yet, our leaders effectively aren't brave enough to do anything. And when I hear that there are now 400 jihadi fighters, fresh back as battle-scarred veterans from Syria, living out in our communities, and yet I listen to the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary who say, we want to remove the passports of people who want to leave Britain to go and fight in Syria. I'm sorry, I want to remove the passports of those who've been to fight in Syria and not let them back into the country. Just occasionally, somebody tries to do the right thing. And Michael Gove, as Education Secretary, took on those Trojan Horse schools in Birmingham, began to root out the brainwashing of some of our children. But of course, he must have done too good a job because he was sacked and removed. And I believe the process went into reverse. There are things that we can do, particularly as schools and particularly as prisons are now some of the main places in which radicalisation happens. These institutions are run by government, and if we have strong government, that radicalisation would not be allowed to happen. But we need to do more than that. We need to start to promote our own values, unashamed of our culture, unashamed of who we are. We come from a Judeo-Christian heritage in this country. We believe in liberty. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in our presumption of innocence before guilt. We believe in our rights to trial by jury, and we believe in living in a democracy. Let's stand up for those values. We have to say those things, and we have to mean it. And unfortunately, occasionally we hear these things from our government, but sadly they don't deliver because they don't really mean it. And as for Her Majesty's loyal opposition, well, he almost sang the national anthem the other day, didn't he? No, Mr. Corbyn, who describes the death of Osama bin Laden as a tragedy, has said today he is not comfortable with a policy of shooting to kill terrorists on British streets. There is no chance of him providing any opposition to this weak government at all. We have got to show those young British Muslims who are tempted by another ideology that actually we're a strong people, that we believe in who we are, and let's offer them something more attractive than that poison that is being dripped in their ear. And then, of course, there is much talk about military intervention. You would think that just bombing people was the answer to absolutely everything. Indeed, it was only 2 years ago that the British government, if you remember, wanted to arm the rebels against Assad. and luckily they were stopped from doing so. Now they want to start bombing some of the rebels. So does that mean they're on Assad's side, or do we bomb him as well? I'm not sure. I'm not actually sure what we're proposing. We have, over the course of the last 15 years, pursued a series of policies, believing that bombing is the answer to everything, and believing that removing Arab heads of state will somehow make those countries better, safer, and stabler. I would suggest that before we rush in to start bombing again in another country, that we actually take a long, cool, hard look at whether that policy has been successful. And I would say that if you look at Libya, look at Libya, for example, where Mr. Cameron and President Sarkozy were so gung-ho that they went in and removed Gaddafi. I'm not arguing that Gaddafi was a good guy, but I am arguing that actually we've made Syria worse and we've increased radicalization. We will not beat ISIS. We will not beat ISIS by just bombing in Iraq and Libya. Frankly, if we want to beat ISIS militarily, we will have to put together a grand coalition of Arab and African states. They will have to provide the troops. We will provide some of the hardware. We will provide much of the intelligence. And we would need to go in to fight them simultaneously in country after country. But from what I can see, we're being asked to support yet another attempt to remove an Arab leader through bombing without any such grand strategy. And that doesn't make any sense to me at all. Going to war is the most serious thing a government can do. We should not go through that undertaking without a big, long-term plan. And we may well need to rethink who our enemies really are. Because for the last few years, the West, whether it's Obama or France or Britain or our friends in the EU, and more of them in a minute, but they've decided that Assad and Putin are evil and that they are our enemies. And I think we're going to have to rethink that strategy entirely, and perhaps the tragedy in Paris will make us rethink that strategy. Assad and Putin may not be our bosom buddies, but they are not the biggest threat we face in the world today. The biggest threat we face in the world today does come from ISIS, and on that great battle, they are on the same side as us, and it's time the government recognised that. So as I say, we already have in this and other European countries a fifth column that we've welcomed into our country and done little to stop. But what makes me really angry, and you will have seen from some of the comments earlier that I was making in April and May and June and July of this year, what makes me really angry is that the European Union's common asylum policy is taking a bad situation and making it even worse. Making it even worse. If it wasn't bad enough for Mr. Juncker to have said that anyone that sets foot in European soil can stay, if that wasn't bad enough, then we had Mrs. Merkel committing, I think, one of the most major policy errors we have seen from a European leader in modern times, inspired, I can only assume, by some kind of war guilt, and leading to a stampede. Indeed, it has led to an exodus of biblical proportions. And yet, the warnings were pretty clear. ISIS themselves have said they will use the migrant tide to flood the European continent with 500,000 of their jihadists. Now, even if that figure's wrong, I would suggest 50,000 is too many. Even if only 1% of that figure is right, I would suggest 5,000 is too many. I would suggest 500 is too many. It only took 8 to cause that destruction in Paris the other night. So we need to be careful. And we were warned by Libyan government ministers. We were even warned by the Jordanians when Mr. Cameron went to visit the camp. And I have to say, at least Mr. Cameron is not encouraging people coming across the Mediterranean and through the Western Balkans. But when he went to visit that camp in Jordan, the Jordanian minister who showed him round said, "Be careful, Mr. Cameron, because 2% of this camp are jihadists intent on getting to your country and doing harm." We have to be careful in what we're doing. I've tried again and again and again over the course of the last few months to argue that we must not let our compassion imperil our civilization. I am all for helping people where they are displaced. I'm all for helping people who are victims of war. I have no problem in rediverting chunks of our foreign aid budget to help people in that plight. But however difficult, however rough it is for many of these people, it is total madness to open the door and to import yet more jihadi terrorists into Europe and ultimately to Britain. And that is a reality that Mr. Juncker, it would appear, has not faced up to, that Monsieur Hollande has not faced up to, because both of them today have said they will continue with exactly the same policy. And I think that is dangerously complacent. In fact, I think that is absolutely mad. This dream of the free movement of people, this dream for others of the Schengen area, hasn't just meant the free movement of people, it's meant the free movement of Kalashnikov rifles, it's meant the free movement of terrorists, and it's meant the free movement of jihadists. And it's time that democratic groups in Britain and right across Europe stood up and fought and gained in strength and said, "An end to this. We want back border controls. We want back national security." Now, interestingly, our Prime Minister last week gave his speech about his renegotiation, of which there wasn't very much. But what he did say was that he thought security was very important. So having discussed some pretty tough subjects, let's just for a moment cheer ourselves up with the news that there is going to be a referendum in this country and that we will have the chance to solve many of these problems. And in fact, let's just have a look at the Prime Minister's track record on this.
In-out referendum. I don't think an in-out referendum is the answer. We're not having a referendum on in or out of the European Union. I think the idea of an in-out referendum is wrong. I don't support holding a referendum that is not our policy, nor do I think leaving is the right answer. We will give the British people a referendum.
I'm here to represent the ordinary men and women of our country. Ask yourself a question. Would you buy a used car from this commission? The question that I want to ask, that we're all going to ask is, who are you? Who voted for you? Right across every member state in this union, and perhaps this is why we see the fear in the faces, increasingly people are saying, we don't want that flag, we don't want the anthem, we don't want this political class. We want the whole thing consigned to the dustbin of history.
I don't support holding a referendum.
We await the results of the European elections.
I'm British. I believe the best people to govern Britain are the British people themselves. We're going to fight damned hard in the next few weeks and put that choice on the ballot paper for you on May the 22nd.
The UK Independence Party has managed to win over the hearts of the majority of the British public.
The People's Army of UKIP have spoken tonight.
What a tremendous surge in the vote.
We are launching the biggest outreach campaign in the history of the Eurosceptic movement.
So we have a referendum. And Mr. Cameron tells us that the reason we've got to vote to stay part of this European Union is because we'll be safer and we'll be more secure. Well, I ask you, do you, in the light of what has happened in Paris last week, do you, in the light of the fact they've decided to continue the open door to the Mediterranean and the Western Balkans, do you feel safer as members of the European Union? Or do you think, like us, that it's time to say no, to take back control of our borders, and to make sure that never again do we have unprecedented immigration into Britain without our ability to check whether people have criminal records, whether they have trades and skills to bring to this country, whether they're bringing their own medical insurance? What I'm saying to you is that to be safer, to be more secure, we have to say no in this referendum. We have to take back control of our borders, and we have to put in place an Australian-style point system so that we can choose who comes into our country. Yeah, Mr. Cameron believes in security so much, he mentioned it 34 times in his speech last week. Well, let's continue with that theme of security and this referendum. Because just a month ago, after a European summit, Mrs. Merkel again made a big decision. And she's decided to fast-track Turkey as members of the European Union. So let's just be clear. Let's just be clear what this means. What it means is we will open up to a country of 75 million who are on average even poorer than Romania and Bulgaria and Croatia, the last countries to join. There will be an open door to another 75 million poor people. And in terms of security, we will be in a political union with Turkey, who of course have extensive borders with Iraq and Syria. Will we be safer and more secure in a political union with Turkey? I don't think so. I don't think so. And Mr. Cameron will argue that we'll have better economic security. Better economic security as part of this European Union. You see, he argues what they all argue. They argue that Britain isn't big enough. Britain isn't strong enough. Britain isn't capable and able of standing on the world stage and doing things for itself. They argue, I agree with you, sir, they argue that we need to be part of a bigger European club. And it first hit me, though, that it was more than that, when last year I did those 2 one-hour debates with Nick Clegg. Yes, but he was very famous once, honestly. And Clegg was making the argument that we haven't got clout on the world stage unless we're part of the European club. We couldn't possibly hope to negotiate our own trade agreements on our own. And I countered Nick by saying that Iceland, with a population of less than 1/3 had just signed off its own trade deal with China. I said it seemed to me that if Iceland was big enough to negotiate its own trade deals on the world stage, that we were big enough to negotiate our own trade deals on the world stage. But then I turned to Nick and I said to him, it isn't about us being big enough. I said, Nick, you just don't think we're good enough, do you? And you know what, folks? That is the truth of it. Our political class, over the last few decades, have lost confidence in this country, have lost confidence in our people. They don't think we're good enough to stand on our own 2 feet, to govern ourselves, to make our own laws, to make our own trade deals, and to control our borders. And my message is, I think we are good enough, because I believe in Britain, and I hope that you do too. And actually what they've done is worse than that. What they've done is worse than that, because through 40 years of lies and deceit, they've actually thrown away, given away, sold the most important, valuable thing that we possess as human beings, our ability as free people to be the masters of our own destiny, to govern our own country. Our rights of democracy and self-government are so fundamental and so important that those that went before us were prepared to risk and in many cases sacrifice everything they had so that we could be born and grow up as free people. What they have done, ladies and gentlemen, is they have literally given away our country. And this referendum is our golden opportunity, perhaps a once in a lifetime chance to undo the wrong that by stealth and deception has been done to us. This referendum for me, above all, what I will fight on, what we will fight on, is I want my country back. We want our country back. We want our country back. Do you want your country back? Do you want your country back? We want our country back. And it's time to say no. Thank you. I'll go back in a minute. Well, the first bit was rather serious, but we got him going in the end. Right, fine. Okay, we'll, I'll go on. Fine. I'm fine. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Nigel, thank you very, very much indeed. What a powerful speech that was, and thank you everyone for being so receptive. You will have seen me, whilst Nigel was talking, going through this pile of questions here, and I thank every single member of the audience who has put a question forward. Can I first of all, though, just congratulate Mr. Phil Hoggerty for probably the most amusing one this evening, which is, do we get a lady come round with ice cream at the interval? Mr. Hegarty, thank you for that. Can I suggest you send your proposal into the European Union? I'm sure they'll take it up at our next meeting. But Nigel, I've got a series of questions that were very, very similar common themes with the questions that were put forward. So I've tried to select the questions on that basis. And the first one, from a young gentleman, Mr. Max Jones, age 17. Well done, Max. Nigel, how will leaving the European Union benefit the youth of Britain, specifically those in higher education?
Well, Max, the first thing to say is there has been a substantial amount, frankly, of brainwashing of young people in this country, and the fact that 21 vice-chancellors of our universities came out with very little consultation with their own boards to say we must stay part of the European Union, otherwise all academic and scientific research would grind to a halt, I thought was frankly disgraceful. I think it's even worse, Max, that throughout British universities there are now about 200 Monet professorships. That is, chairs in British universities where they teach history and economics from a European Union perspective, funded by money from the European Commission. So I think some of these attempts to subvert the minds of our young people are wrong. Max, let me tell you what the biggest benefit for you as a 17-year-old and for all young people in this country would be. I thought young people believed in liberty, believed in freedom, and believed in having power over their own lives. You cannot have power over your own life if you're a member of a political union where most of the laws that govern the land are made somewhere else, and over which the British voter at a general election can do nothing to change it. So, Max, the first point is your generation will be better off because they will actually be back in charge of their own destiny. But I think, I could argue to you that economically we don't need this union. We don't need to pay in over £50 million a day. That we'll have a free trade deal because they sell us a lot more motor cars than we sell them. I could make the arguments, as I've just done, that politically we'll be better off governing ourselves and making laws appropriate for our own country. But Max, there's something else. I think we'll be better and prouder and hold our heads higher, and we'll start believing in our country and our people. And when we do that, we'll achieve far more for ourselves and on the world stage too.
Question number 2 from Mr. Gordon Johnson. After we have won the referendum, are we going to have a second referendum foisted on us, as happened in France, the Netherlands and Ireland?
Well, yeah, Gordon. Gordon is basically saying that, I think Gordon said if we vote to leave. What Gordon meant was when we vote to leave. What Gordon really is asking is, will they trust our result? And he's right to ask that, because back in 1992, the Danes in a referendum voted no to the Maastricht Treaty. That should have been the end of the matter, and yet they were forced to vote again. The Irish, twice the Irish have voted against European treaties in the last 15 years, but been forced to vote again in some of the most appalling one-sided electoral contests in terms of money and media coverage that I've ever seen. The French and Dutch voted no in 2005 to the European Constitution, only to be completely ignored as the Constitution was rebranded as the Lisbon Treaty, and nobody ever asked them again. Would I be content for us to win this referendum, have an enormous party, I'm quite looking forward to that bit of it, and then pack our tents and go home, and saying back to you chaps, to hand it back to the very people who frankly betrayed us in the first place? No. Winning this referendum is vital. Without it, we cannot succeed. But I also think we're going to need strong political voices there, providing an electoral threat to make sure they carry out the wishes of the people, and we intend to do exactly that.
Jodie from Eastleigh has asked Nigel, if you were Prime Minister, what would your action plan be in light of the growing security risks to our country? And Jodie, you asked this via Nigel's Facebook page, so well done for interacting with us on that basis.
Terrific, thank you. I'm sure there's a few Facebook questions that have come through. Jodie, wherever you're watching this, look, I think I dealt with a bit of that. The first point about dealing with security is you must be in control of your own borders. You must make sure that you check and log those that come in and go out of your country. The second point about security is being able to defend yourselves effectively. And I have to say, well, I wouldn't let Mr. Corbyn do it, obviously, but he wants to abolish the army, doesn't he? Yeah, and I'm sure any Labour voters here who were wavering as to who they should support, just remember that Mr. Corbyn wants to abolish the army, give the Falkland Islands to Argentina, unilaterally disarm, get rid of the Queen. I don't think he poses a great electoral threat to us, I have to say. But Jodie, the one thing I would say to you is this. I think that what the last government did, and indeed governments before, in terms of slashing the Navy, the Air Force and the Army to a point where we simply could not defend ourselves and increasingly are not being taken seriously on the world stage. I think it is madness not to pay the insurance on your house. You hope there won't be a fire, but if there is a fire, you need to have that cover. And what has been done to our armed forces is an absolute disgrace and threatens our security.
Question 4 from Mr. Frederick Barlow from Chesterfield, long way from home here in Basingstoke. Nigel, when we leave the EU and find it is not as good as we hoped, will there be a returns policy?
Look, Frederick, the whole point about being in control of your own country, about being the master of your own destiny, is I'm quite sure that British governments can make terrible policy mistakes, just as Mr. Juncker and the gang in Brussels can make terrible policy mistakes. But there is a difference. Once something that is proposed by a commissioner becomes a European law, there is nothing that we or all 651 of our MPs can do to change that law. It's European law. It's in the body of European law. There is nothing you can do. If we have a rotten British government that makes a total horlicks of it, we can, at the next general election, vote for a new government, kick them out, get rid of the rascals and replace them with somebody else who will undo all of what they did and put in place their manifesto. That is what parliamentary democracy is, and it will give power back to us, the people, and there will be no point in time when I believe going back to Europe will be the right thing to do.
Another question from your Facebook page, Nigel. From Norcan. Nigel, do you think the tragedy in Paris is Merkel's fault for allowing individuals into Europe with no background checks?
Well, look, I'm not going to lay the blame at one individual's door. That would be a mistake. But do I think the policy that the European Union has been pursuing since it implemented its common asylum policy back in April and May of this year, I think the evidence is there. I've said it loudly, clearly and consistently. Yes, Mrs. Merkel is a big part of this, but what's clear today is that Mr. Juncker and Mr. Hollande have learnt nothing from it. We will continue to import terrorism into Europe in the name of being compassionate, and I cannot think of a bigger, better or stronger reason for us to say no in this referendum to protect ourselves from such a folly and such a threat.
From Mr. Graham Bentley, when you, Nigel, become our next Prime Minister, how will... Absolutely, yes. How will you tackle our declining farming and fishing industries to make them thrive like they used to?
Well, I think we need a bit of electoral reform within the United Kingdom to make that a possibility. But anyway, that's perhaps another battle that we fight once we've got back the independence of this country from the European Union. Our fishing and farming industries, well, basically, we've been under foreign rule now for just over 40 years. And our farmers, some will argue that they've done okay out of the European system. Others will argue the opposite. What I would say about farming is I think that everything that has been done in the name of the EU has played into the hands of big farmers and giant agribusinesses at the expense of the small and medium-sized family-run farms. And I think there has been a mad rush towards the intensification of agriculture, which personally I do find slightly distasteful. When it comes to fishing, there's a very, very different answer. We, as a result of the common fisheries policy, are only allowed to catch 18% by value of the fish that swim in British territorial waters. 18%. The rest is divvied up amongst our European neighbours, and just to make it worse, we've had for nearly 30 years a quota system whereby in mixed fisheries like the North Sea, We throw back more dead to the bottom of the ocean than we land in our ports. It is complete and utter madness. It has in fishing, it has in processing, it has in boat building, and all the other associated jobs and trades cost many tens of thousands of jobs since 1973. And you only have to look across the other side of the North Sea to Norway. That's the country, by the way, the Prime Minister thinks it would be dreadful for us to be like. Can you imagine life being as bad as it is in Norway, folks, here in Basingstoke? I mean, can you imagine being rich? Wouldn't that be dreadful? Can you imagine being free and democratic? Can you imagine being happy? And can you imagine, getting back to the questioner, being able to catch your own fish? And Norway have 200 miles of the North Sea that is absolutely, exclusively theirs under economic law. They have a thriving fishing industry. If anybody goes to fish in Norwegian waters, they have to pay for the privilege of doing so, or they're impounded by the Norwegian Navy. No mucking about. And they have an environmental policy where it is a criminal offence to throw any single fish back dead into the sea. I want my country back. I want my territorial waters back. I want our fishing industry to be back to what it was years ago.
From Mr. Brian Costa, why is the USA wanting us to remain in the European Union?
Well, there is a bit of history here. I mean, don't forget that the Americans did pay an absolutely massive price in World War II, you know, both in the European theatre and the Pacific theatre, and that after 1945, you know, right up until the end of the 1960s, there were nearly 500,000 American troops on European soil there as our protection and our safety against any potential Soviet threat. So the cost of World War II to the Americans didn't end in 1945. It went on for decades to come. And there were many in the early days of the European project who thought, well, if Europe all get together and love each other, we won't need to have 500,000 people on American soil. So historically, there was a line of thinking in the USA that said that. Coming more up to date, we have a president in the White House who is the most anti-British president that the United States of America has ever had. His first act on day one was to remove the bust of Winston Churchill, which had been there for decades in the Oval Office. When there was the spill, the unfortunate spill in the Gulf, under BP's umbrella, he couldn't say often enough, could he? British Petroleum. Said it with a degree of venom. Obama is going to do, in the time that he has left, all that he can to keep Britain trapped inside the European Union, and he even put up a lackey that works for him, a trade envoy, Robert Froman, the other week, who said if Britain was outside of the European Union, America would not do a trade deal with Britain. What complete and utter and total baloney. And actually, Obama and his lackeys like Froman are threatening one of the most important strategic and friendly alliances that have existed in the world. And I hope that America gets a better president who understands us more next time round.
From Melita Jeffries, originally from Croatia. Relatively speaking, the European Union is beginning in many ways to resemble Tito's Yugoslavia, the artificial state that collapsed in war. Could the European Union share the same fate as Yugoslavia? And is there a possibility of war in Europe?
Well, the lady said she was from Croatia, which I visited a few times. An incredible place. But of course the Croat history is a pretty cruel one. The Croats spent something like, and Melita can correct me if I'm wrong, where are you in the audience here? I can't see it. It's a big auditorium. Yeah, hello. I think I'm right in saying, aren't I, that the Croats spent 800 years seeking independence. 800 years seeking an independent Croatia. And then after the fall of communism, they got an independent Croatia, and yet 25 years later, they've surrendered it to the European Union. I have to say that does not make sense to me, but of course their politicians and civil servants have all got very rich as a result of it. I'll leave a number at the end for where to send the lawsuits, okay. What Yugoslavia shows you is that far from it being a project of peace, you cannot put together different countries with different cultures and different languages and different flags and different anthems and identities and histories. You cannot force them into one under a new flag and a new anthem. And don't forget, Yugoslavia was founded to stop war amongst those countries. What they thought in those days was, back in 1920, give them one flag, one police force, one president, they'll be peaceful forever. Well, look how it ended. You can't do it without consent. And that's the point about the European project. It's been done without consent. When the French and Dutch were asked, did they want a constitution for a new superstate? They said no. We would have said no. I've no doubt the Germans and the Danes and the Finns and the Swedes would also have said no. So don't listen to this rubbish that it's brought us 70 years of peace. No, it hasn't. NATO and the nuclear deterrent are what brought us peace since 1945, not Brussels. And far from it being a project that is bringing us all together, actually, I grew up in a Europe that was split from east to west by the Berlin Wall. I'm now going to work every week in a Europe that is divided by a new Berlin Wall. But it goes from north to south, and it's called the Eurozone, where the Mediterranean have been forced into a currency that was never going to work for them. Unless the Greeks become like the Germans, this is never, ever going to work. And you see poverty and mass unemployment and constant bailouts. And actually what I'm seeing are great enmities now growing up in Europe. I don't think, Melita, we're going to see Europe descend into war, but I do think we're going to see Europe descend into political extremism, and at some point, in one of those Mediterranean countries, the people will lose patience with politicians who haven't got the guts to take them out of the euro and to put them back with their own independent currencies. And I'm going to go on. And actually, I spoke more today, obviously, about the horror of Paris and where I think we need to go, perhaps than I normally would at one of these meetings, because we're doing these meetings all over the country. You know, in the course of the last few weeks, I've been in Belfast, and I've been in Gateshead, and I've been, all at Gloucester and Chester, and you name it. And it's my kind of Billy Graham tour of Euroscepticism, you know. But I think, I think the one thing that's worth remembering is if we vote in this referendum and we follow the Prime Minister's advice and we keep things as they are, we're not voting for our relationship with Brussels to stay as it is. We're voting to stay part of an integrationist club. And remember, the people in this country who were saying we should vote that way, apart from the Prime Minister, the leaders of that movement, were the same people who told us 15 years ago that if we didn't join the euro, we'd be ruined. And I'm thinking of Lord Mandelson. All right, I can do better. I can do better than that. Tony Blair. There we are. Thank you. And there's Ken Clarke, who's quite a nice chap, actually. Yeah, difficult to boo. And there's Richard Branson, who's been wrong about everything. And there we are. So actually, I forgot the CBI. The CBI, who've been wrong about everything forever. I'd only represent the giant corporates and not the small, struggling, medium-sized men and women entrepreneurs in our society. The point I'm making is you are being sold this argument by people who thought we should join the euro. They were wrong then, and they're wrong now.
Nigel, we have 5 more questions left. This one, though, nice quick one.
I'll be very quick. All right.
Do we close our borders now?
Well, I don't know about close our borders. What we do is we take back control of our borders. That's the point.
With the migrant problem, why are the Arab countries not doing more?
Well, I mentioned Saudi Arabia
From
earlier.
Mr. Tony Bilson.
Yeah, I mentioned Saudi Arabia. But actually, the same goes for Qatar, the same goes for the United Arab Emirates. The 6th wealthiest Arab states have not lifted a finger to help their fellow Muslims in such deep trouble as a result of war and poverty and displacement. I think it's about time Europe said to those countries, isn't it time you gave us something of an example?
From Mr. Kevin Bartlett, why will we have to pay Brussels even if we come out of the European Union?
Well, this again is Mr. Cameron saying, oh yeah, but poor old Norway, they still pay money into the European club. Well, actually what Norway do is they give money to some of the developing countries in Central and Eastern Europe. They don't pay that money directly through Brussels. And Norway and Switzerland are relatively small countries who rely overwhelmingly on their foreign exports on EU markets and who trade with the EU at a massive trade surplus. We are a country of 65 million people. Well, that's the ones we know about, anyway. Now, this is supposed to be a serious meeting. So we are a country of 65 million people. We are now the Eurozone's biggest export market in the world. And they sell us far more than we sell them. They sell us about £50 billion worth of goods, more every year than we sell them. I don't know about us paying a contribution. They should be paying us for the privilege of selling all those motor cars.
The penultimate question, Nigel.
It won't happen, of course.
That's right.
But why should we pay anything to allow access for German motor cars and French wine and all the rest of it? Why don't we just do business with each other? Why don't we just be friendly with each other? Why don't we just act as good neighbours with each other? Why don't we respect each other and our differences? And let's be happy being friends with Europe. But once we're freed from these shackles, let's re-engage with other parts of the world that we turned our backs on. And what a good start it would be to re-engage with the Commonwealth.
The penultimate question, Nigel. One of the old chestnuts here. The argument is always that the NHS would not survive without immigrants, but no one from UKIP, part of the EFDD group, of course, ever counters the argument with the amount of immigrants using the NHS. Could you comment from Mr. Church?
Oh, look, I commented on this during the general election, all right. Crikey. I thought I was going to be chucked in the Tower of London. For daring to suggest that it should be a national health service and not an international health service. And can I say, as somebody who's needed the NHS more than most in my life, with various accidents and disasters that I've been through, and generally been treated pretty well, I must say, that there are lots of very good foreign nurses and foreign doctors working in the National Health Service, but isn't it a crying pity we're not training enough of our own nurses in our own country?
And your last question, from Mrs. Lambourne. Cameron's renegotiations, Many fear that Mr Cameron's renegotiations are a charade and that a deal in essence has already been agreed with the Eurocrats on the basis of associate membership model as detailed in the Spinelli Group document and the Five Presidents report. If this is the case, how do you propose to counter Cameron's apparent latest strategy of positioning himself as Mr Moderate on the centre ground between the Remainers and the Leavers? Well done, Mrs Lambourne, a very detailed question.
It's a great question, and yeah. Look, he started off saying we would need fundamental treaty change. He's given up on that. He started off saying we would have to have a debate about the free movement of people. He's given up on that. The only way you would ever get anything in Brussels is to walk into the room carrying a great big stick. This is what the French do. And showing you've got the full intention to jolly well use it if you don't get what you want. He's already thrown the stick away. He's asked for virtually nothing. The only thing he's asked for is a change to migrant benefits, but that will only be doable if he changes benefits for UK workers as well. And anyway, the issue, folks, isn't migrant benefits. The issue is over 600,000 people coming to Britain last year. The number is too big. The number is too unsustainable. The pressure on wages, the health service, the pressure on our primary schools, on our way of life in this country, not to mention the security risk, says that fiddling around with migrant benefits simply isn't enough. Now, on the other stuff that he's asking for, I know what's going to happen. There'll be a lunch. There always is in Brussels. A series of promises will be made, and he'll be given a promissory note. He'll fly back into Britain. They may even reopen Croydon Airport for him. And he'll say, I have in my hand this piece of paper that promises to amend and update the future European treaties to exclude Britain from the euro. Well, we're not going to join anyway, are we? We're not going to join anyway. And he'll say a great deal has been done, that whilst France and Germany and others wish to push on to a fuller political union, we have now become associate members. Isn't that just the most wonderful package? And what it'll mean is nothing. It'll mean we still have the supremacy of European law. It'll mean we'll go on paying £55 million a day. It means we will go on having a total open border to nearly 500 million people. They may have managed to pull the wool over our eyes collectively 40 years ago. I don't believe they're going to do the same thing again. Thank you very much indeed. All right.
Very good. Well done.
You're going to close it, yeah?
Nigel, thank you for an absolutely superb evening, for an inspirational speech, and for taking and tackling the questions that no other United Kingdom political leader is prepared to face. As you leave the Anvil this evening, everyone, ask yourself this question. Would David Cameron, would Tim Farron, would Jeremy Corbyn, would Natalie Bennett, would Leanne Woods, would Nicola Sturgeon, would any of them do what the EFDD group does and what Nigel does in terms of taking this message around the country? We thank you very much indeed. Just a few more minutes of your time, everyone. I set out what the referendum goal is. It's the United Kingdom's relationship with the European Union and with Europe, but far more importantly, it's the United Kingdom's relationship with the world. Remember, the future, it's yours, it's your children, it's your grandchildren, but it's the United Kingdom's. We all want, I hope, you wouldn't be here this evening if you didn't want a sovereign nation, one that controls its own destiny, and to use that fabulous phrase from Mark Reckless, not a star on another organisation's flag. Take those messages, everyone, into your home, into your workplace, into your social circle, wherever you can. On behalf of the EFDD group here in Basingstoke this evening, on behalf of Nigel and the team who've worked so hard behind this to put it together, thank you for coming tonight. Travel safe and see you soon, I hope. Good night.